All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited that you joined us today, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Fanuel, and I'm the Chief Resident here at SAI. Before we get going, I wanted to just do our land acknowledgement that we traditionally do here before we start our event. So we acknowledge that we live and work and learn on the traditional lands of many tribes of indigenous peoples across North America. We acknowledge the past, present, and future human impact our communities have on indigenous ways of life and the land we inhabit. We honor with gratitude the land itself as a living entity that supports countless interconnected beings and the ongoing connections of indigenous peoples to these waters, lands, plants, and animals. As we continue to gather virtually from around the country, we encourage you to learn more about indigenous peoples who have stewarded and who continue to steward the land you inhabit, and to continue seeking ways to honor, cultivate meaningful relationships with indigenous peoples, non-human animals, and the land and water. I do encourage you all to go to our website and check out that land acknowledgement and learn more about ways you can support indigenous peoples where you live. So with that, as I mentioned before, I'm the Chief Resident here at SAI, founder, Chief Resident, and I have the distinct honor today of introducing our speaker, Tara Nicola. But before I do that, I wanted to just give you a quick update on some of the work my lab here at SAI has been doing. This is tradition here at SAI where whoever's introducing the speaker does a few notes about their work and then connect to the speaker. So I run the M Lab here, the Marine Lab at SAI, and what we focus on is really the development of new ideas and initiatives at the interface of the informal STEM learning ecosystem around the world. I find it really fascinating to study how these initiatives and programs develop, how they exist, and also how they die. They do die. It's something that I'm really fascinated to study more and understand how those work. And not only that, we then also engineer new tools and programs, right, to support new exposure, training, career development, education, of all diverse ISL workforce, right, and broader publics. So I find it really exciting to then think about the problem and then think about ways to solve the problem. And so our programs here at SAI, the interns and the summer, the fellows, really focusing on that, thinking about the research side for the interns and then the actual building of tools. And I encourage you to check out our fellows program page to learn more about what they are doing and so forth. So at the bottom here, you see the research leads to tool development, leads to program development, and here are some tools that we've done, the research we've published, tools we've developed. I encourage you to check out the journal Stories in Science. It's kind of awesome. And some of the programs, for example, the Fellows program that I mentioned previously. And I would like for the first time introduce you all to our new publication that just came out. It just got released this past weekend. Where we are talking about SAI and what we're doing, what we're trying to do here, this experiment that we are running. It truly is an experiment that we're trying to run. And I thank you all for being part of that experiment. And I see wonderful faces here. Some of them I've not seen you for a while. Thank you for joining us today. So I would like to introduce Tara Nicola, who's a PhD candidate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her research focuses on issues concerning access, choice, and equity in higher education, especially in relation to college admission process. I got in touch with Tara just by mere luck and chance. I had LinkedIn her, I read her profile, and I was so intrigued about her work that I thought to myself, let me just try and reach out and see if she responds and we can engage. And we've had some wonderful conversations so far, and I knew that I wanted to invite her to tell us more about the work that she's doing, thinking deeply about issues of access. All of us here at SAI are in one way or another thinking about access in various ways, right? Of course, for us, STEM is at the center of what we think deeply about. And I think her work thinking about access in this dimension has a lot of corollaries with what we're doing. And I'm so excited to just learn more about that work and learn about some of the insight that she has garnered from her research. And so Tara, it is with great honor that I welcome you, and I look forward to engaging you with your work. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Manuel. I really appreciate you having me here today. Let me just share my slides. Okay, thank you again for having me. I'm really excited to share about my research and engage in discussion with you all on topics that I am very passionate about. I really wanted to just first start off by briefly sharing a bit more about myself, who I am and how I got into this line of research. As a mixed methods researcher, I think positionality is so important to understand how I conceptualize this research that I'm undertaking. So I'm a fifth-year PhD student at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. My research focuses on issues of access and equity in higher ed, particularly with respect to the admissions process. I got interested in this area when I was an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins. My work-study job was answering the phones in the admissions office. Over 4 years of interacting with admissions staff, students, counselors, families on a near daily basis, I saw firsthand the barriers that these students were facing in the admission process and was inspired to help be part of the solution in fixing them. I started on my journey to being part of that solution when I worked at NACAC, National Association for College Admission Counseling, where I was on the research team. And then at Harvard, I've been very fortunate to conduct research with a number of organizations in the higher ed access space, which has really enriched my perspectives on the issues that I study. The core question guiding my work is how to increase access to higher education and in particular, selective higher education. My work is situated at this nexus of the K-12 and the higher education sectors. And I'm really interested in understanding how the practices of two groups of educational actors, the college counselors on the high school side and the admission officers on the college side, influence students' college-going outcomes, particularly their application behavior, their admission outcomes, and then their ultimate enrollment outcomes at elite institutions. And the specific practices I focus on are the college counseling in the high school context and the holistic review process in the college context. My interest in elite college admissions is motivated by the fact that access to these colleges in the US remains highly inequitable. Clear disparities exist along socioeconomic and racial lines. You've probably seen or heard of Chetty's 2017 paper, his analysis of how colleges affect intergenerational mobility, where they found that more students from families in the top 1% of the income bracket enroll in Ivy Plus private schools than those in the bottom 50%. This graph is from his paper that shows that students in the top 1% are 77 times more likely to attend an elite private than those whose parents are in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. Reardon and his co-authors found in their analysis of enrollment trends at selected institutions that white and Asian students are highly overrepresented in elite colleges, with white students 5 times as likely to enroll in a highly selected college as Black students, and almost 3 times as likely as Hispanic students. And more generally, it's estimated that 20% of the undergraduate populations at these institutions are comprised of low SES and first generation students. These figures are concerning for a number of reasons, but one is that elite institutions can afford a path to upward mobility for many students from historically marginalized backgrounds. Students benefiting from high graduation rates, large earning premiums, access to high prestige sectors, and low levels of unemployment associated with attaining degrees from these institutions. And this is especially important for students interested in STEM. While selective colleges have not done significantly better than other types of colleges in closing, sorry, the lights go out in this room. In closing racial and gender gaps in STEM enrollment, the most compelling case for attending a selective college for STEM majors is that they are more likely to graduate than if they attend a less selective institution. There are countless factors that shape students' post-secondary enrollment outcomes, in particular, whether they attend a selective college. These factors range from everything from their family, their school, their neighborhood context, and their impact on students' aspirations, to more macro factors like we saw during COVID when students really questioned whether higher education is for them. But one set of actors that impacts enrollment outcomes is the higher education institutions themselves. Through their admission policies and practices, these institutions determine who applies, is accepted, and ultimately matriculates. Work by Mike Bastido at the University of Michigan has highlighted how the holistic review process that selective admission offices use to evaluate applicants can pose as a barrier to access if admission officers don't have all of the data they need to support their comprehensive assessment of applicants. A holistic review strives to evaluate applicants in the context, considering the opportunities and resources afforded to them. As a highly individualized form of assessment, it is relying on contextual data about applicants. And one primary source of that contextual data is the application portfolio that students submit as part of applying to a school. This consists of the application form, recommendation letters, essays, test scores, transcripts, and other school furnished documents. And there is an emerging body of work interrogating these different components of that portfolio, looking at the degree to which they support holistic review or merely perpetuate inequities. One study, for example, came out last year from a group of researchers at Stanford looking at student submission essays and identifying trends in the content of those essays by different student characteristics. But out of all of those application components that support holistic review, two that have perhaps been the most understudied are the school profile and the recommendation letter. And my larger dissertation project focuses on these two components. I'm going to focus today's talk mostly on the former because that project is complete, so I have results to share. But I will also be giving you a preview of the work I'm currently undertaking on the recommendation letters, which is very much in its early stages and still in progress. I'm curious if anyone here has heard of a high school profile before. No.
Loosely.
Maybe. Okay. Before I started this project, I had no clue what one was. But profiles are brief documents that high school counselors submit to a college in conjunction with a student's transcript. The profiles are designed to provide admission officers with information about a particular high school, which is critical to supporting holistic review, as academic performance is consistently rated as one of the most important factors in the admission decision. Admission officers are usually assigned to read applications by region, spanning states, countries, and even entire continents. So it's not possible for them to know every detail about every sending high school in their territory. And the profiles are designed to fill this gap in information, highlighting specific facts and figures that would be useful when evaluating an applicant. Unlike every other part of the highly standardized admission application, however, there is not a profile template. Profiles are designed by each school, and they have great leeway in determining whether they even put one together, and if so, what goes into it. Despite most selective colleges requiring these documents, they do not explicitly state so on their websites that these documents should be submitted. It's largely an unspoken rule in the counseling and the college counseling realm that counselors should be sending these documents to colleges. On the right-hand side of the screen here is a screenshot of a profile from a high school in Washington State, which is pretty typical of the ones I looked at in this project. Despite the school contextual data being so important and school profiles being the vehicle for disseminating that information in the application, there is no research to date about profiles and the degree to which they are actually providing admission officers with the information they need and want to equitably evaluate applicants. So that's where my study came in. It explored how admission officers utilize profiles, what contextual data points promote the holistic evaluation of applicants, and to what extent profiles convey that information. These are the specific questions I looked at in this study. I employed a multi-method qualitative design to answer the first and second research questions about admission officers' perceptions of the high school profile and its value. And the value of its content. I conducted interviews with 25 admission professionals at selective colleges. The interviews focused on how the participants conceptualize the role of the profile within the evaluation process. And they also incorporated a cognitive assessment activity to intensely probe their perceptions of the profile. So I provided a school profile to each of the interview participants, asked them to essentially walk me through reading it, to know any facets of the profile that stood out to them, which data points were useful, and most critically, what was missing, if any. This exercise was intended to generate fruitful discussion about the elements of the profile that are necessary for promoting a holistic assessment. Drawing on the themes that emerged from the interviews, I then undertook a descriptive content analysis of secondary school profiles. Doing so supported the systematic documentation of contextual data and profiles, and perhaps more importantly, being able to document what information was missing. To obtain profiles from a diverse sample of high schools, I pulled a stratified random sample of 300 schools, 200 public and 100 private from the National Center for Education Statistics, a Common Core of data, and the Private School Universe survey. And then with the help of a research assistant, I contacted all of the schools and asked them for their profile. If we couldn't find one online, we would email the head, like the principal of the school, the college advisor, the head counselor. And in total, we were able to get profiles from 100 schools across 45 different states. And then proceeded to undertake the content analysis of them. I'm going to share a few findings. And the first is about the role of the profile. The admission officers underscored the value of a secondary school profile as a source of academic context and a holistic review process, noting that profiles provide essential information about an applicant's high school environment that is useful and often necessary to make comprehensive and equitable admission decisions. These are two quotes from Cindy and Eric about why they use profiles. Cindy describes how the profile puts meaning to the numbers in students' applications, while Eric emphasized the insight profiles offer into the quality of a school, a student's performance, and the typical peers in a student's class. Because they believe profiles are so important in providing this contextual data, most of the admission officers I interviewed felt a subpar profile could potentially be detrimental to an applicant. These are just some other quotes from additional admission officers emphasizing that these documents are so important because they do not know every detail about a high school, even the ones that they might visit every year who are feeder schools. These documents are important reference sources for them. In particular, Kyle pointed out that given the high number of applications that he's expected to review each day during the reading season, he doesn't always have the luxury of searching for information about an applicant's school context if it's not provided, and shared that if he's not able to find the information he needs about a student, he may not have a choice but to move on to the next file. Admission officers made clear that profiles are important. So I was next interested in understanding what information they thought these documents should contain. Despite their varied backgrounds, the admission officers I spoke with were generally in agreement about what data elements the profile should include. And there were 15 data points consistently mentioned, falling broadly into these 5 categories. Due to time constraints today, I can't go through each of these points one by one in depth, but I'm going to show a few examples of some of these data points and how they're presented in a typical profile. First and foremost, admission officers search a profile for information about a school's academic curriculum. They look for information about the course offerings, particularly if there are honors and advanced placement courses, or if there are curriculum quirks. For example, if any part of the curriculum distinguishes the school, like a STEM-specific initiative, in order to assess whether applicants challenge themselves academically. The importance of this curriculum was especially true when evaluating STEM applicants, as they are usually expected, as you know, to have taken advanced science and math courses. Jack, one of the admission officers, explained how failing to enroll in these courses, if available, could potentially penalize a student. I think this quote in particular is really compelling when he said, "I like to look for higher level offerings, specifically how many APs, if they're going to apply for engineering. If they don't have calculus, my first look is at the profile to see if it was offered. If it was, then you should have taken it. If it wasn't, well then that's not your fault. I won't hold that against you." The officers in my conversations with them are also very clear that profiles should discuss policies related to enrollment in advanced courses, in addition to just stating what courses are available, specifically whether there are limits on the number of limits on the number of classes students can take. Some schools, for example, limit students taking 3 APs for their whole tenure. The grade that students can begin enrolling in these courses, and if students need to be nominated or receive approval prior to enrolling. Not only do admission officers want to know what academic opportunities are available in a high school, but also how that institution assesses its students. Grading systems, as you can imagine, vary enormously. So when evaluating a student's transcript, it is imperative to understand how exactly those grades were determined. Admission officers also really appreciated grade distribution charts. Some schools will provide a chart for the entire senior class saying ranking students by grade point average. Some admission officers say that they like to see charts for particular high school classes. For example, a math or science class might be particularly hard. Krista, one of the people I spoke with, was talking about if a student gets a C in one class, they may not look too great on their transcript, but if the average grade in that class among everyone is a B-, then that C isn't looking too bad. When reading a profile, admission officers also look for basic quantitative information about a school. Most of the admission officers I spoke with believe that information about a school student body is important in supporting their holistic assessment of an applicant. The racial demographics of the student body, the number of students enrolled, as well as the size of the senior class and the graduation rate are all useful figures. And of particular interest to admission officers was the percentage of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch, as they use this data point often as a proxy for the student being of low income background. And it's just a quote from one of the counselors emphasizing why this data point is important to her when she's evaluating an applicant. The fourth bucket is related to post-secondary outcomes. Related, the college-going culture of a school is a critical piece of information that profiles also should convey. Admission officers looked for the percentage of students progressing onto 4- and 2-year colleges, as well as information on where students from a school previously enrolled, as that information is suggestive of the types of college preparation resources, guidance, and support students likely received in that particular high school environment. So I've seen profiles where they list every school of the previous graduating class where they're going, and others that summarize just highlights. But in general, those quantitative data points around college going rates were really valued, and then standardized testing data as well. And finally, admission officers consistently mention seeking information about a school's community in a profile. This is the qualitative description that often takes the form of a brief paragraph, providing an overview of different facets of the school, like its type, for example, if it's a charter or a magnet, the grade levels it serves, the neighborhoods it serves, and its mission. And admission officers were particularly interested in school enrollment policies, including, for example, if there are criteria for enrolling, or if students have to participate in a lottery in order to get accepted. So this was all the information that the admission counselor said was important. So after taking this, I then looked at all the profiles to document what was actually in them. And just one out of all 100 that I looked at included all 15 of those elements I'd put on the first slide. The average number was about 9. I talk more about this in the paper, that the study that I'm pulling from for this talk, but there are differences in across school types in terms of what information is in a profile. Private institutions are more likely than their public counterparts, for example, to reference institutional policies, specific school initiatives, and the colleges their alumni attended. But the starkest differences I found in content were between elite high schools and other high schools. Whereas almost all the profiles for the high-performing high schools included a comprehensive overview of grading policies. For example, a little more than half of the profiles from the non-elite schools, I think 57% or so, offer this information. So that's a pretty big difference. Admission officers often have access to some of this critical information about a high school, particularly the quantifiable data, like the average test scores, the four-year college going rates, or the school size. They can typically find that through the Common Core of data or through testing agencies. The College Board, for example, has been providing a lot of that information now to schools. But it's the omission of this more qualitative information in a profile that I argue can be really deleterious. It's when they lack that qualitative information, the description of the school's community, its academic offerings, information that in many cases may not be available elsewhere, and this becomes problematic. And just something I wanted to point out was not only were there clear differences in content, but also in the aesthetics and how this information was presented. When admission officers are reading files, they might be reading 40 plus a day. And they have to search for information quickly. And there are really big differences in terms of how information was presented visually and how effective it is in conveying that information. So on the left is a glitzy profile from a private school in Florida. And on the right, the St. Stephen's profile is like 5 or 6 pages long, which is too long, but it is very comprehensive. And then this one is a high school from Arkansas. And this is the only document that the admission officer got from the high school. So what are some takeaways from this work that's applicable to you all in the STEM space? Given your positioning in the education sector and the access to students, schools, and universities it likely affords, there are ways that you can help. Those of you involved, for example, in STEM initiatives can help provide high school counselors information about your program and encourage them to include it in their profiles. Relatedly, if you're involved in STEM access programs in high schools, if you build networks with admission professionals in colleges and universities, helping bridge that divide between counselors and admission staff is key. In my study, I was really curious that very few of the admission officers I spoke to had stated that counselors asked for their feedback on profiles. And those that did were the ones that established some sort of relationship with previously. So often these are the private school counselors. And I find that this relationship building across these sectors is really key. Helping to facilitate those connections is really important. And then more generally, those involved in the STEM advocacy in the college prep space can educate students, parents, and other stakeholders involved in the admissions process about these documents. One of the main issues, in my opinion, is that no one knows they exist. So schools and districts aren't held accountable for what they do or do not produce with these documents. So increasing awareness of their importance. I now want to switch gears slightly to talking about my second but related project about recommendation letters, so a second component of the application portfolio. Like profiles, recommendation letters are a common application component in the admission process, particularly at selective colleges. We can see here at the most competitive colleges, they are requiring letters. Almost all of them are. These colleges typically require both teacher and counselor letters. I'm interested in counselor letters specifically. They are unique for a few reasons. One, in that they are focusing more generally about students' academic performance, whereas teacher letters are in theory supposed to be more narrowly tailored to students' performance in a particular class. And second, because counselors have to submit a letter to all students applying to a college that needs one in their caseload, they might be submitting many letters, whereas a teacher is only might be submitting fewer. So in my work, I use that to my advantage to be able to look within counselor and compare the letters they write. On the right here is just a screenshot of the counselor recommendation form that most selective colleges require counselors to submit. And then in addition to filling out this form, they also have to upload a PDF letter. Despite their ubiquity, there's very little research on these letters and the degree to which they actually support holistic review. Most of the research on letters has focused on those used in personnel selection and in graduate school admissions, specifically entrance for medical school and for residency programs. The graduate admission research is the most relevant for the context I'm studying. A number of studies have looked at the predictive validity of letters, either assessing their predictive power of specific letter attributes. Others have found that letters reliably predicted outcomes like academic and clinical performance, but other works include just the opposite, so some mixed evidence. There's also a sizable body of literature investigating differences in letter content and features across applicant subgroups, also yielding mixed results. Some studies have found few differences in letter attributes across applicant demographic characteristics like race and gender, while many others have identified striking linguistic biases. One recent paper that I think is pretty rigorous, that might be a question. Oh, no worries. One recent paper from 2019 that I think is quite rigorous looked at differences by applicant gender and the content of recommendation letters for a residency program. They found that letters for male candidates are more likely to address topics like leadership skills and careers, while those for female applicants focus heavily on work ethic and caregiving. Just one study has really explored letters in depth at the undergraduate level. This 2016 study I referenced analyzed about 5,000 teacher recommendation letters from one selective public university. They implemented regression models to examine how letter length and the types of adjectives used to describe students differed by applicants' gender and race, as well as by teacher characteristics. They found that letters for male and underrepresented minority students contained lower proportions of grindstone adjectives, or those that describe being a hard worker, than letters for female and white applicants with similar academic profiles, respectively. But no studies to date have looked at counselor recommendation letters, nor have they been able to look at counselor letters at scale beyond just single institution case studies. Recommendation letters from high school counselors are a primary source of contextual information in the application application profile. However, there is limited understanding of what information letter writers share, how that information is conveyed, and whether systematic differences in letter content and features exist across applicants and high schools. And such disparities are concerning if they have the potential to further disadvantage already marginalized students who face countless barriers in the admission process. My dissertation project uses advanced quantitative techniques to explore the landscape of counselor letters nationally, looking at these three questions in particular. So letter similarity, what information is in letters and how that varies across schools, and then looking in particular at how counselors describe applicants and differences by race and gender. So trying to replicate some of that earlier work done. I draw primarily on student level data from the Common Application to do this project. The Common Application is an online platform used by over 900 colleges, including nearly all selective colleges. Over 2 million students a year create a Common Application account, and about 1.1 million end up submitting at least one application. I have access to not only student demographic information, but details on whether they applied to college, where they applied to college through the Common Application, and when. So the application level data, information about the colleges that they applied to, for example, if the colleges require that they submit a counselor letter, information from the counselor recommendation form that you saw on the previous slide, and then most exciting is the raw text of the counselor letters that counselors upload as a PDF through the Common Application portal. And I linked this student data with a bunch of other data sets, iPads, so college characteristic data, data on students' high schools, and then some other measures that I've been able to find. This is an example of what the letters look like. This is an excerpt from one of the letters. They have been de-identified. But you can see what I get to read every day. A lot of them are not very long, but there are differences in length, and that's one of the features that I look at.
Tara, is there a limit to how long these letters are in the instructions for counselors?
No.
Interesting.
They can upload however long of a PDF they'd like, or not upload one, even if one is required. So I use machine learning and natural language processing techniques to document the content and the feature of these letters. I use different softwares to do this. Luke is one that has been used in previous work that looked at the gender and racial differences in letter content, and also topic modeling, which is a form of unsupervised machine learning. So this project is very much still in progress. I finished with data cleaning finally, and I'm starting my analysis. I'm getting through my analyses of the first research question related to the text similarity. Because I'm very interested in being able to document if counselors are reusing letter content. Anecdotally, and speaking to counselors over the years, they have shared that they don't, when they have a caseload of 500 students, they don't know all their students. They don't have time to write letters that are in depth about each student. And I really want to be able to see if I can identify that support that anecdotal evidence with quantifiable data from nationally, looking at students from across the country and the letters they have their counselors submit. Again, this is still very early in my project, but based on the results that I'm running, there are indications of linguistic biases in letters, which would align with some of the prior work in this area related to the recommendation letters for graduate admission. Biases in terms of the types of adjectives that people are using, for example, to discuss students of different genders or races. And just some things to be aware of as you work with students. As STEM professionals, particularly those who work with high school students, may be asked to write recommendation letters. Remaining cognizant of biases in the letters you write is really important. And I think being able to make this a priority institution at the institutional level in terms of trainings for best practices around this is really important. There's a lot of resources online. It's actually, which I'm happy to share, there's a lot of work from that medical school literature about best practices for writing recommendation letters that needs to gain more traction. And it's clear from my analyses that counselors are reusing letter content across letters. I've found one counselor who submitted the same letter 300 times. Yes, that is happening. Not every counselor. There are a lot of counselors who do write unique letters for their students, but there are those who are not. And that's something I'm really excited to document. But also for those who are working with schools and with students, to not be afraid to be an ally to counselors. As I mentioned, the average student to counselor ratio nationally is almost like 400 to 1. So counselors have a lot of students they're in charge of, and trying to write 400 letters, if they need all 400 students are applying to colleges that need them, is pretty wild. Being able to supply counselors with information about students is very helpful, and you should not shy away from doing so, because that can really help them be able to write those detailed letters that they might not be able to otherwise, because they don't have that one-on-one connection with all of the students on their caseload. And that's my talk. It's been such a pleasure. I'm really happy and excited to engage in conversation about this, and happy to continue this offline. I do reply to all my messages on LinkedIn, so feel free to message me on LinkedIn or email or Twitter.
And I can attest, she does respond to LinkedIn messages. So Tara, thank you for that. Oh, there's so much in there to dissect. Oh my goodness, where do we get started? I'm gonna refrain for a little bit and see if anybody has questions first, because I can easily hog the whole conversation, but I will not do that. If you have questions here, those who are in the Zoom room, please just go ahead. I see one, Abu, and so I will introduce Abu. Abu is one of our summer interns, actually. So he is, anyway, Abu, I'll let you introduce yourself. Go ahead.
Hi, as Fenwell kindly noted, my name is Abu. I'm a rising senior, feels weird to say, at Williams College studying chemistry and anthropology. Yeah, and I'm actually super interested in like the work of like selective college admissions. I don't know if I work with Matriculate, which is an organization that helps low-income, high-achieving high school students apply to selective colleges. And I guess I was a little bit curious, what sort of, when you're using like elite and selective colleges, what qualifies the types of schools that you look at when forming these questions?
Great question. For my project, I define that as schools falling within the top 4 tiers of the Barron Selectivity Index, which was an index that researchers use in my field. So every college is assigned a score and placed in different bands, essentially. So the score is based on admission numbers, like test scores, selectivity rates, yield rates, et cetera, to come up with that index. So that is a great point. And for what I'm looking at for elite here is those fall within the top 4. So these are largely like the top 200 or so schools, if you were to look at like US News.
Awesome, thank you.
Corey?
Hi there, my name's Corey. I'm a program manager here at SAI. And that was a really interesting presentation. I was just interested in, you talked a lot about a holistic review and how this supports that kind of a concept. What would be a successful outcome of your research to be able to support that kind of a schema?
Yeah, thank you. A successful outcome would be to improve the quantity and quality of information that high schools are able to provide to colleges. A number of organizations, like I mentioned, the College Board, have really tried to do this at scale, but they are only able to really capture quantitative measures. You know, the number of students who attend a school, the percentage of students who are low income. They don't capture those other things like the course enrollment policies or like the grading system. And you can't put that into like a database that or it might exist in database, but not that the College Board is able to capture at this point. So being able to increase the quality of that information we get to colleges, something that I'm really passionate about and I'm interested in continuing to work on with the Common Application and others, is creating a profile template or more resources for counselors to use to create profiles. It's not something that you're just like taught how to do. I think a lot of counselors learn from seeing other profiles or from like hearing what should be in a profile. So taking the guesswork out of that, having colleges, for example, and instead of not listing this as a requirement, explicitly state on the website, on the counselor, portion of the website, most of them have like a counselor page. We require profiles. This is what we want in your profile, and this is why. I think being able to have that information, counselors can then advocate to others in their district, in their schools. These colleges want this information, and this is why, and we should be providing this to them, and hopefully give the counselors the resources they need to collect that data. And then with regard to the recommendation letters, I'm really interested, the Common Application, who I've worked with to obtain this data, is really interested in improving the recommendation letters. And something I'm really interested in is looking at really transforming how we think about recommendation letters. In the medical school literature, there's been a lot of work around structured recommendation letters. So instead of just telling someone, just write a letter, it's more like a short answer, like tell me these very specific things about this student or this applicant. And studies have found that those letters are helpful both for the letter writer to be able to write more focused letters, but also for the letter readers. And that if you ask, for evidence of someone's research capacity or whatever, and they are writing about that, You don't have to search for a whole letter, like throughout the whole letter for that one piece of information. So those are two potential avenues for how this research can hopefully inform practice on the ground.
And I think that actually has a nice lead to my question. Clearly, counselors are overwhelmed, right? There's
Oh yes,
the 400 to 1 ratio is, oh my God, my goodness, is intense. And I'll answer your first question you posed, or how many people have heard of high school profiles. I'll be honest, I actually had not heard of this until today.
No one else does either. They're not alone.
I'd heard of it in a different context for something else. I had something else in mind, but this is fascinating. So each student that applies to college needs to have this in their profile of some kind.
So the schools that have a selective process, they are expecting to receive this. If a student doesn't submit a profile, they will review their application anyway, and they might reach out to the counselor and ask for one. That's not going to like stop the review process, but it's expected that they do submit one because they don't know about the high school otherwise. Sometimes the counselor will include some of that like high school context in their recommendation letter. Like you're not going to copy, verbatim the grading policy in your recommendation letter. So it's still not capturing a lot of that background context that would be in a profile.
I see. And for those schools that are sort of in the, and so not lower tier, but low resource, I would say lower resource settings, where counselor has, 500 of them to write. I mean, I don't know if you have this data where do you see that those students, and of course, have less likelihood to have these profiles, right? And does that impact their ability or their odds of being accepted, right? Has that been that trajectory sort of mapped to look at that?
I haven't been able, so the study I did was definitely not causal in any capacity, but work that has been done prior, Mike Bastido, I mentioned at Michigan, has run an experiment providing admission officers with different types of information and seeing if it impacted their decision of who to admit. And they included in that experiment like some of the types of contextual data that you would find in a profile, and found that information did in fact influence whether they chose to admit someone or not. So that's probably the closest evidence I can find for now. This work is very hard to do. In social science work, we cannot run experiments as easily as you folks can. But yes, there is evidence that the information admission officers access does influence the decision-making.
Yeah, I have a bunch more, but others, please, if you have a question, please jump in. Hey, Madhvi, go for it.
Hi, I'm Madhvi. I'm an assistant professor of biochemistry at Vanderbilt, working in the science education space, more focused in graduate education. I guess my question is related to some of the movements away from standardized tests and how that has impacted high school profiles and how and the holistic review process at the college level.
Yeah, great question. So first, the move away from standardized testing is placing even greater weight on these other components, because there's one less application component to base admission decisions on. So letters are very important. During COVID, for example, when many schools, and even now, were remote or changing their curriculum to adjust for these changes in their students' learning environments, counselors were encouraged to share that information in their profiles, but it's not clear how many actually did. I know a lot of admission counselors who I spoke to over the past year or so kind of felt pretty blind or not as competent necessarily with some of their decision making when they don't have that as much context as they need to really decide like whether this applicant is ready for their institution. You want to admit students who are going to succeed and graduate, and make sure that your institution has the resources to support those students. And they weren't confident that their institutions necessarily had all of those resources. If the student like missed 2 years worth of math, would they be able to make sure that they're on track to still graduate in 4 years?
And as I have my practice hat on, I'm always, thank you so much for sharing these tidbits of like, hey, there's a opportunity here to design X, right, for Y, right? And to Corey's question earlier, where we're just talking about, hey, what are some of those practical elements of this, right? And my mind was going crazy thinking about, oh my God, yeah, someone can like build a tool to help these counselors do X, right? So what kind of, is there training for these? I'm assuming there's some sort of training, but are there existing tools or programs or organizations that are targeting them, or is it just, there's a dearth of support for them?
Yeah, great question. There's a big professional association called the American School Counselor Association, which is a big kind of professional body in the field. And it's very active nationally, and they also have a really active kind of state affiliate chapters who work with counselors. There are a lot of tools in the ed tech space. Think of like Naviance, College Wars number of tools, Zello, that are aimed at like helping students, counselors do their job better in supporting students. I think a lot of the issues stem from not having enough counselors. Like there's only so much more you can do with like a tool. That tool can't replace having a physical person to meet with students and like do the things that counselors need to do, particularly in something as intensive as like a college admission process where you need to meet and talk multiple times, ideally, throughout your 4 years. And it's not just transactional, but let me give this to you, this information tidbit to you. I think so that's the big piece, is having more counselors. A second is that states each are in charge of their certification requirements for counselors, and they vary widely in terms of the training that they're expected to have going into the role. Generally, counselors do not receive very robust training in college counseling. A lot of the role, as you can imagine now, has focused to shifting on social emotional counseling. And that's what a lot of like principals are really emphasizing that counselors are doing. And I think a lot of the training programs are tailoring their curriculum to that. Oh, I'm so sorry. So resources, like high quality training for counselors in college counseling specifically is something that they always call for.
Yeah, and then in terms of the pipeline, right? Train like a career. I think maybe there's an issue there where someone was trying to design something, right, to fix this issue or to try to ill it, is to like, what do we do to encourage more young people to go into this field, right? And I imagine as well, counselors itself is not a like homogeneous body, right? They are a diverse group, and I think if you, even your questions, if you were to break it up in terms of the letters they're writing and the profiles they put, separating them across men, women, or whatever group, yeah. I think it'd be fascinating to look at that, right? To see if there are differences and how counselor X of background Y writes these letters versus another counselor, right? And
yes, that's what I so want to look at for this project. So I don't have the Common App doesn't collect data on counselors' demographic information. So what I wanted to do is be able to match up like our counselors of like the same race or same gender of students. We see them writing different types of letters in those cases than for students who differ from them on their identities. That type of work's been done a lot in the quasi-experimental literature.
Yeah, because I think that then you can, if we as practitioners, right, can be even more nuanced in our approach. And I think this is for me why I'm very strongly in favor of very fundamental research in this space, right, where you can find these questions, and then from those answers, you can then design something that actually addresses a very specific issue. Yes. Right. And I think that's kind of the message I'm always trying to, that's why I support very much fundamental research in this space that informs practice, and vice versa too, but practice can inform research, right? It's not a one-way street, it's a bi-directional engagement.
Yes.
That is required.
Yes.
Other questions? We have a couple of minutes left. So tell us more about what's next for you, Tara. Graduation potential soon, but go ahead, tell the rest of the folk what's going on.
I need to finish this project so I can graduate, hopefully next spring. I want to have a career in education research, ideally continuing this work in the higher ed access space. This is what I'm passionate about, and this is what I want my career to be. So I know at this time in my life, I don't want to pursue an academic position. So I'm considering research positions outside of academia, foundations, think tanks, research firms, potentially an institutional research office at universities, which I'm really, I think, most interested in, because you really are working to support change on the ground at your own institution, and support daily decision making to support student success. So that's something I'm really interested in looking into.
Yeah, and I think I'm always a fan of those folks that are leaving the academe to doing other things. As someone who's done that already as well, it's a great space out there, and I think there's a lot of opportunities. And I encourage you all to look up Tara's profile online. Just Google her name. You'll run into a lot of her writing. Like I think there's an article in Brookings Institutions, for example, that I found really insightful as well, thinking about access in a very different setting. Again, it's just, I love that you're thinking about this issue of access in multiple contexts and getting to the root of these issues, right? And understanding the problem, and then giving us some of these insights and saying, hey, if you want to be built, if you're working in this space already, or if you're trying to build something new, here is an opportunity for you to try to really, dig into
much
this.
opportunity. There's a lot of room for improvement here. So we need all the help we can get.
and especially with the STEM, like our focus is in STEM, and even just thinking about counselors that have like, what sort of training do they have in terms of STEM, like differential training, right? What is that like? Is there a heavier weighting on one field versus another, and how does that impact into the students, right? And their profiles and so forth. I think there's so much there that we can parse out, and we can keep talking all day long, of course. But we don't have that much time. And so with that, I just, again, I'm left with a lot to think about. I hope you are as well. Tara, thank you so much for those insights. I think we'll have our summer interns watch this. First of all, I'll make sure they all watch this. And for our future fellows and residents to really just take note of some of the work you've showcased and the literature review you've provided for us. Thank you for that, because I think we have a lot of digestion that we need to do. So thank you so much for everybody else joining us, and stay tuned. Next month will be our interns will be pitching their project. So it'll be super exciting to hear their proposals, their research proposals that they are designing right now and what they hope to achieve. So with that, have a great day and see you soon.
Thank you.